How's it going? This is episode number 3 of the Foundations of Intramelioration. I've been saying it wrong the entire time. I was saying intramelioration, but it's intra and then amelioration, so together it's intramelioration. We're going to talk about neuroscience on this one, about how and what intramelioration inherits from neuroscience, how it diverges from neuroscience, and then how it transcends neuroscience. And that transcends does not mean better. If anything, it just means it goes beyond, it goes outside the scope of neuroscience. If you don't know what neuroscience is the scientific study of the nervous system, and that includes the brain, the spinal cord, and then the entire nervous structure of the human body. Before I start, I just want to talk about kind of like what I was thinking about when I was writing the notes for this video. As I'm doing these videos, as I'm learning about the field and learning about how it, and when I mean the field, learning about intra-amelioration and how it is distinctive from the other fields. It's kind of like how we learn about ourselves when we were growing up, how, we had others to kind of say that, like, we are not, as in we learned about ourselves from distinction. And as I do all these videos, the form of the field is slowly beginning to reveal itself to me, and it's a very cool thing, because as I understand more fields and how it's different from intra-amelioration, I'm starting to understand intra-amelioration more, and how powerful and what the potential for it is, which really just excites me more to create these videos and really make this field a solid sphere of knowledge and an impactful sphere of knowledge. So what does it inherit from neuroscience? First things first, and probably the biggest thing, is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, basically, neuroscience discovered. I don't know the neuroscience scientist that discovered it. Shout out to him or her. But neuroplasticity, it basically says that the brain changes, right? The brain doesn't stay the same. It's like as we learn throughout our lives, your neural pathways are either getting strengthened or they're getting weakened, and we'll get more into that. Actually, we'll just get into that right now. When it comes to habits, right? Your behavior is just it's like an emergence of a strong neural pathway, especially when it comes to habits and doing things that you're not necessarily conscious of. It's like, how are you doing them? Well, you're doing them because there is a neural pathway that is so strong in your brain that when a neuron around it fires, that neuron also fires, and that pathway fires, and then that pathway leads to a behavior, kind of like probably how my hands are moving. Maybe it's just a bunch of neurons that are firing around, when I'm speaking, how I like to convey my message. So yeah, we got neuroplasticity, or intra-amelioration. I keep saying intra-amelioration inherits neuroplasticity. It also inherits the fact that, again, that your neurons change, but then how do they change? And it's by attention and repetition, right? It's what you give your attention to. It creates a stronger neural link. And also, the famous saying, what fires together wires together. When you do things not in a certain sequence, but when you do things kind of in relation to each other, those neurons get fired together, and then that is what becomes a habit. And not just a physical habit, it could also be a mental habit, right? When it comes to looking at certain things, when it comes to noticing certain patterns, that's all just a reflection of your neurons kind of not just strengthening, but also showing how hard and wired together that they are. What we also get from neuroscience is that cognition is embodied. A lot of people, not a lot of people, but it's been discovered that, stress is not stored in the mind, it's really stored around the body. And again, your nervous system is not just in your brain. You have nerves in your hands, you have nerves in your feet, you have nerves in your back, in your legs. And, with these nerves, it's storing cognition, right? It's storing memories. It's storing the things that you've been through. It's the reason why you might get tight somewhere else, because maybe you're thinking about something and then those nerves are firing in that certain area. What we also get from I keep saying what intramelioration also gets from neuroscience is the default mode network, and this network basically signifies that, or this network is, it's really when you're focused on yourself and you're extremely conscious of yourself. And this happens when you are not focused on a task. Flow state. I got in flow state a lot when I was bartending. It was so easy to just kind of snap into the flow of things. Pouring, making certain drinks. Mixing certain concoctions up and pouring it correctly. Making a martini or cocktail drinks. Very easy to get in flow because I wasn't focused on myself. However, if I was focused on myself, it would be hard to get in flow. And we'll get more towards the default mode of network later. Now let's go towards divergence. So where does intramelioration diverge from neuroscience, right? Where is the split happening? The first thing is reduction versus integration. Neuroscientists, maybe they're not reductionist, but the field itself strives to conceptualize the mind by pointing at and correlating a mental phenomenon to a brain stimulus or to a brain activation. It says, when this neuron fires and then you feel these chemicals, then it's this emotion. Intramelioration, it integrates the brain, right? The brain is not where everything ends. If anything, the brain is an instrument, and I'll get more towards what it's an instrument for, but intramelioration, it doesn't see the brain as the stopping point. If anything, it sees the brain just like the body as an expression for something much more fundamental to the nature of the universe. Also, where a split is happening is intramelioration. It looks for meaning. We'll go back to the neurons and how you can consciously place your attention upon something, and when you consciously and repetitively do that, you are strengthening that neuron. Neuroscience just stops at that. They don't say, okay, well, what does this mean for you? And what does this mean that you are? What does this feeling mean? Yeah, there's, oxytocin, there's love, but, what does love mean? And what is this love that you kind of get mentally? Where another split kind of happens is, and this is with the hard problem of consciousness that neuroscience kind of struggles with, is that it treats the brain as primary and consciousness as something that is emergent from the brain. There's two spots that they believe consciousness are emerges from, and that is the cortex and then also the upper brain stem. And I'm reading this book right now, fantastic book. This is The Hidden Spring by Mark Solomons. And a big portion of the front end of this book, obviously I'm not it's upside down. Yeah, I'm not too far in, but the front end of this book, it talks a lot about, certain cases where, people got injured or animals had certain parts of the cortex or certain part of the upper brainstem missing, and how much differently their experience was. So I, obviously from those cases, it would be hard to kind of separate the brain from consciousness. However, um, intra-amelioration, it treats consciousness as primary. In a lot of these cases, it's described that when someone is missing, a piece of the cortex or a piece of the upper brainstem, that they're more emotional, or they're more what's the word, more animate. And I'll offer my opinion. I think that's because there's just more consciousness flowing through that would have been actually divided between those two parts of the brain, the cortex and the upper brainstem. Obviously, when I think you remove one, it just funnels the rest of the consciousness that would have been in that one part into that one part, which makes that person seem much more animate, and much more expressive. But again, intra-amelioration, it diverges because it does not treat consciousness as a secondary from the brain. If anything, the brain is for consciousness. And I think this a lot because as I, did my reading and my studying and my writing about evolution, it appears to me that, evolution is very much for consciousness, as if consciousness already exists. You have the cells going from unicellular to multicellular to then specifying and then becoming organs and then organ systems. It's almost like, and I learned this from the I think it's like the power of belief. Let me grab the book. I have to grab the book. Okay. Wait. Oh, Bruce Limpton. Great book. Definitely read this one as well. But in that book, The Biology of Belief, he goes through, evolution, and basically he says that evolution was for the increase of consciousness. So it's like, yeah, we have a brain, but that brain is a product of evolution. So if we really place evolution as being somewhat for consciousness, then consciousness has to be much more fundamental to the brain, which also, it doesn't solve the hard problem of consciousness, but if anything, it says that the scope that they're looking through is too small to include consciousness in it, because the brain, or consciousness, precedes the brain. Also, where intra-amelioration kind of diverges from neuroscience is description versus volition. Again, for example, going back to the neural pathways, it says, attention and repetition, and then you get a stronger neural link. And if you don't give those things attention, then those neural links weaken. But it doesn't give you the power. It doesn't give you power. If anything, it just says what it is, and then it stops. Whereas with intra-amelioration, it gives you what I call sovereignty. If you are able to consciously give things that are not within your brain attention, and then create neural links for that thing, then at some point in time you have to understand that you are the shaper of your brain, which then makes you not the brain. Because if the brain is always changing, then you cannot say you are that which is changing, because you are the thing that is changing the brain. Lastly, where intra-amelioration diverges is neuroscience. It treats the person as their brain. It says, well, it's, you have this brain issue, you're missing this. Intra-amelioration, again, going back to the last point, it treats the person as the shaper. It treats the you that which you are truly as the architect of the brain, which is what leads into where intra-amelioration transcends neuroscience. The first thing is that man, right? It treats man as, and man, obviously I say man, and you probably think of human being, but it treats you that which you are, so man in quotations, as being beyond the material and beyond the mechanism. It doesn't treat you as the brain, it doesn't treat you as the body, it treats you as something that expresses through the body, like the mind is expressing through the body, like the mind is expressing through the brain. It also treats consciousness as primary. Again, I believe that consciousness is more fundamental than the brain. I don't believe the brain gives birth to consciousness. Obviously, when I'm reading for the book, when there's alterations in the brain, there's alterations in consciousness, but that does not mean that consciousness stems from the brain. If anything, it means that an altered brain is going to alter the experience of consciousness. It's going to filter consciousness, which is exactly what the brain does. It filters reality for consciousness to perceive that which it is kind of conscious of. And another way that intramelioration kind of transcends, or not even kind of, but transcends neuroscience is that it integrates the mind, body, and spirit. With neuroscience, it's very materialistic, it's very much external, it's very much looking at matter. However, it doesn't integrate the spiritual aspect of things. It doesn't integrate the fact that I can imagine something, and maybe that thing doesn't even exist in my brain yet, but the fact that I can imagine it and imagine it more and more and more, and then that imagination becomes much more of a routine, much more of a habit, and then time goes by and now I have that thing present in my life. Thus is what these books and these technology and all these things are. It doesn't take account for the invisible, which is another way that intramelioration transcends neuroscience and a lot of the external fields or externally based fields, is that it doesn't take into account what you don't see, the unseen, the invisible. And lastly, where intramelioration transcends neuroscience is it gives you agency. It doesn't just give you clarity. It doesn't just give you knowledge. It gives you the manuscript, or the manuscript. It gives you the manual of how to engineer your brain. Because you can engineer your brain, because you have engineering your brain, because neuroscience has discovered and confirmed for us that you do change your brain by consciously giving attention to things and not giving your attention to certain things. And also, what I forgot about inheritance was that perception is filtered. We thought that the world goes in and then that's it. However, your sensory apparatus, we'll call it, when you hear things, when you see things, especially when you see, not just seeing but also seeing and understanding, like an event happening, what you're seeing is going through filters. It's not going through just as raw data. If anything, it's going in raw, but then it's getting filtered through the neurons that already exist, through a type of filtering pathway. Therefore, you don't actually see raw life for as it is. You see a perception of it. So that was inheritance, what we got from neuroscience. I keep saying what intramelioration got from neuroscience. The big thing, neuroplasticity, that was divergence, right? Where intramelioration diverges from neuroscience, in that, we'll say a big thing is intramelioration treats consciousness as the primary instead of the brain creating or stimulating consciousness. And then lastly, a big thing where intramelioration transcends neuroscience is the fact that it treats you. And when I mean you, I don't mean the you that you believe yourself to be. I mean the true you that is not just has a brain, but also can shape the brain by consciously giving your attention to things and then adding repetition to that sequence. It treats you as something that is not just the brain, not just a mechanism, which positions you in a place of power to be able to then engineer and re engineer your brain and therefore your experience. So, clear distinctions. Number one, neuroscience, reduction to matter. That's reduction to what it sees. If it can't see it, it's gonna struggle with it. And that's it's trying to reduce the mind to a one-to-one relationship with the brain. However, with intramelioration, it is a matter of integration. That rhymed. I know. Album coming out soon on SoundCloud first. Obviously, but it integrates the brain. It doesn't say that the brain does not exist. It doesn't say that the brain is blah 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 blah. The brain is very much a part of the equation. However, the brain is not where the equation starts. And if anything, it's not a one-to-one relationship. It is a one-to-many, because there can be many different meanings for the mental phenomenon that is then triggering the brain to um, emit its actions as such, if I explained that right. Number two, neuroscience is mechanistic. It treats the brain as a machine. It treats you as a machine. If I do this, then you'll I got a burp. Ooh. Whereas intra-amelioration, it gives meaning to the brain's processes. It gives meaning to the fact that you can shape your brain. Number three, another clear distinction is that neuroscience, again, the brain is primary. Intra-amelioration, consciousness is primary. Consciousness does not come from the brain. The brain comes from consciousness in the very same way that consciousness kind of arose from cells somewhat unconsciously looking to become more conscious to then increase their survivability, which is basically evolution. I believe it to be. Another distinction is that neuroscience gives description and intra-amelioration gives power, because it positions you not as a brain but as something that can shape the brain. It positions you as an architect. Another distinction is neuroscience. It intervenes with chemicals. When someone is having a chemical mental imbalance, it goes to drugs, or it goes to wherever it goes to. But intra-amelioration, and that could be also therapy as well. But intra-amelioration, it intervenes with architecture. Right? It goes deep. It doesn't stop at the brain. It goes beyond the brain to consciousness and really starts to understand your understanding, your beliefs, your identity, the core things that kind of are the structure of your inner architecture. And then from there, it intervenes there to then lead to a more global fix beyond consciousness, into the brain and into the body. Another distinction is that neuroscience, there's just the mind and then the body. There's the brain, the mind, the body. If anything, I think they do accept that, or it's really just mind, body, right? There's the mind, the brain, and then the body. However, with intramelioration, it's mind, body, spirit. Because you have agency, because you can shape your brain. The way I envision it, it's almost as if you are the energy that is funneling the neurons and building the neurons. And there's volition with this energy. You have influence with this energy. If anything, you are that energy that is strengthening the neurons more than what the neurons are shaping, because then, you can say that you are not the brain, but the shaper of the brain, which is a much more spiritual take, but then you also have impact on the mind and thus the body. Another clear distinction is that, and I just kind of spoke about it, was that neuroscience treats the person as the brain, whereas intra-amelioration, it treats the person as the architect of the brain. Again, positioning you in a position of sovereignty where you are not at the whims of your brain. If anything, you are at the whims of your architecture. And lastly, neuroscience, it sees consciousness as a hard problem to solve. Whereas intra-amelioration, it kind of sees that the scope of neuroscience is too small. It's trying to define something that exists within the unseen and the invisible, and because it cannot point to it exactly, it has a hard problem. But it's because it's you're looking at something that is not externally based. You're looking at something that can jump, to the past, to the future. You're looking at something that can enter this land of imagination, this place that does not exist, and then bring things into existence that once, and which then kind of widens the spectrum of existence, and then not being something that it just exists here and now, but being in a place where now emerges from. Hopefully I did my best. I'm trying to do my best. Obviously neuroscience is a big field. I apologize if I explained anything wrong. These are just my thoughts, my initial thoughts. Obviously, as I learn this field more, I'll probably make this video again with a more concrete learning and a more concrete example. But as much as it is for you to kind of see the power and potential of intra-amelioration, it's really making these videos and doing these papers. It's really for me to fully understand what it is that intra-amelioration is, because I've been I've been pointing at it and looking at it my whole life, but without the lens of a concept on it, so I couldn't grab it. But the more that I do this, the more graspable it becomes. I'll see you in the next video.